you. Hello. Good morning. Everyone can hear me? Can we hear you, John?
I think so. Hey, there we go.
They're not quite ferns, but we'll sit down.
We're not fern worthy.
How's everyone doing? What do you think about this DevOps thing?
Yeah.
Is it gonna be a thing?
I think with next 10 years, maybe. I don't know. We'll see.
So how do we get here?
How do we get here?
Who are you?
Well, hold on. Google me or Google Andrew. I think that, one of the things that so Andrew and I have been like really close friends. Andrew's been an incredible mentor to me, so my first experience with DevOps. So I'm John Willis and Bachkaloob, and I think the rest you could probably Google. So Michael Cote, where are you?
He's probably jet lagged.
He's probably still sleeping. I used to do a podcast with Michael Cote called the IT Management Guys. It's like car talk for IT. And he did another podcast called the Agile Executive, Michael and this guy named Israel Gat, and Andrew was one of their guests. And so I'm driving in my car and I'm listening to this podcast. I knew Andrew, we met a while back. And in fact, I'll tell another great Andrew story in a minute. So I'm listening to podcasts, and Andrew starts talking about this thing called Agile Infrastructure. And at this point, there's been the word DevOps, it wasn't known. Question whether it was ever used, and it was, so I almost drive off the road, because I'm an ops person. I've been in infrastructure my whole life, and I knew about Agile, but I wasn't a developer. But when you put those two words together, I'm like, this is me. How can I find this? So I called Andrew, and I'm like, you got to tell me about this Agile Infrastructure stuff. And he's like, I've been working with this guy in Belgium, and there's a really funny story there. Now, Patrick's in the room, surely, right? There he is, okay. And so I'm like, I have to feed me. And I track down Patrick. And I call him, and he says, yeah, we're going to run this DevOps event in Ghent. At the time, I'm working for Canonical, the Ubuntu folk, and Simon Wardley, if you have never heard of Simon's Wardley Maps. And Patrick says, I'll tell you what, if Canonical pays for your sort of travel, we'll give them a logo sponsor. And I'm like, I talked to Simon. Simon, we have to be doing this. This is like, you got to trust me on this one. And so I went there, and it was the first DevOps days, and it was incredible. In fact, at that point in my career, I'd been doing a lot of sort of large enterprise infrastructure stuff, and I was really starting thinking maybe I should be selling shoes. And there's nothing wrong with selling shoes for a living, but I was really tired of what we were not accomplishing in large banks and all. And I watched all these young...
I'm still tired.
Yeah, I'm way more tired now.
I'm exhausted.
Anyway, I saw all these people, and I can go through the list of these people who have been influential of spreading DevOps around the world. Lindsay Homeward in Australia, Stephen Nelson Smith, Ari Paneer, I go through the list. Chris Byatt, make sure I mention him, and of course Patrick. And then at that point, me and Patrick had a conversation, and I said I'd like to sort of do this in America.
You got to say Bridget.
What?
Bridget Cromhout.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is a
second wave of.
Yeah, this is a shoulder of giants.
Yeah.
People, will go to Andrew and say, "You invented DevOps," and I was involved in the beginning.
Whenever anyone says that,
yeah.
I always say I stole it.
Yeah.
I stole DevOps from my friends.
And it's an incredible shoulder. Anyway, so that starts a whole. We do the first DevOps days at Mountain View at LinkedIn. Andrew, me, and another person who should be mentioned here is Damon Edwards. We put that together, and that's a huge event. And it's tied to velocity. So Andrew, what's your sort of? We don't always agree on the formation of DevOps.
I like the David Hume quote that truth emerges from the arguments among friends. I'll just say to begin that DevOps has been such a blessing in my life, and all these people that I've made friendships with and have been able to do this kind of work with, there's certainly things that I made choices about, but a lot of it was just the circumstances and being able to have the conversations that we did. And then in particular, I mean, all these people you mentioned, Cote, I had, at the time I was a puppet, and we'd started working with Red Monk. And in some ways, because of some of the stuff you and Cote did, I was aware of a lot of the podcasts and the stuff, and so we got in this loop with Cote making content, and I just tried to put my ideas out there. So my background really was as a software developer, and then I came into this domain in Puppet focused on writing software to automate things. But a lot of my background was kind of like XP practices, continuous integration, and I really had struggled in some of the other startups I'd worked at before that to manage the differences in infrastructure between environments. And so I just wanted to bring continuous integration to the infrastructure as well, and like have this. And now I mean, we've seen where it's evolved, and there's pipelines and all this other stuff. But from the very beginning, one of the people that I had on my radar, and there's also this like confluence of cloud, right? So like people have all these buzzwords, right? Now now there's new buzzwords, and there's all these subgenres of DevOps, right? So there's like observability is its own little community, and like chaos engineering is its own little community, but those are kind of the same things we were always talking about. And one of the things that I personally appreciate about John is I would like basically give like some sermon, and I'd have like all these crazy ideas in my head, and I would say words, and then everyone's like heads would explode, and like no one would understand what I'm talking about. And John would come like, sweep it all up and like make sense of it and like say it in a way everyone else could understand it. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to sort of, it haunted me for a year. We'll get to what I think is the greatest president. And it sounds like we're like artificially admiring each other. We fight like brothers. like let me tell you, like I love this man, but like we disagree on a lot of things. But he gave a presentation.
Until we don't, right?
Yeah, until we don't. And we usually figure out how to agree. But he had this presentation. I'll just skip a little bit ahead. I'm sorry. But the best presentation, and I've been to more DevOps days than anybody else on the planet.
I think that's true.
And the best presentation ever given that I've ever seen is a presentation he did called "There Is No Talent Shortage," and we'll talk a little about that in a little bit because it is sort of profound, and it's way before a lot of stuff we're talking about now. But in there, this is the thing I'm going to haunt you with, is he mentioned something called a Pareto inefficient Nash equilibrium, and for a year, I tried to figure out what the hell that meant. So his point...
It was my gratuitous self-indulgence.
I finally figured it out, and then I started presenting, and then passed that sort of bad torch to other people. But yeah, I mean, like Andrew says things or talks about things, and I'm like the meat and potatoes person, and I know that when he says something, it usually is, a lot of times it is sort of profound, and even though I don't get it at first, but then I figure out like, can I get it, and then can I explain it? So he's been an incredible mentor to me in almost everything that we've done here.
So on the thread we're pulling on right now, I think that you can't really talk about DevOps and DevOps days without recognizing like some of the foundational stuff that happened at Velocity Conference. So that talk is at a Velocity Conference in 2013, but then the Velocity Conference that happened in 2008 was sort of this, it was a very, very interesting time. It facilitated these other conversations for this book, the web operations book that both Patrick and I wrote a chapter in, and my chapter is called Agile Infrastructure in that book. And like you said, we were talking about this morning, that would probably be called DevOps.
Yeah, if it would have come out like 3 months. So you should look it up. Like a lot of it is very relevant to this. Web operations, John Ospar was sort of sponsor, Adam Jacob, founder of Chef, Eric Reese, Lean Startup, Andrew, Patrick. I mean, it's like these Theo, that's right. Yeah, incredible people.
Jesse, like
Jesse Robbins, who was mentioned in the presentation yesterday about.
But the word DevOps that everyone sort of uses now is in some ways you can draw a line to this 10 deploys a day from Flickr presentation.
Well, that's the thing. I do want to talk about that, but you're right. That book, Web Operations, had come out. I say 6 months, Genesis 3, whatever. It would have been called DevOps or Intro to DevOps. It just missed the window because it was everything you was built on. And one of the things so a lot of people like Gene Kim and other people will talk about John Allspar's 10 deploys at Flickr at the not Agile, at the Velocity 2009, and you know, and I was in the back of the room, right, and like my sort of fictional narrative of it was people were throwing up and like, you can't do this, humankind will be
irresponsible,
destroyed, like this is, and it wasn't that.
Now 10 deploys a day is
you suck, you know, like, but here's the thing, like all the discussions there, if you've ever seen the wall of confusion picture, like ops on one side, a wall, and then dev on the other side, and that's the thing that, like, for me, being an ops person my whole life, like when I saw it, so there was a presentation that wasn't video recorded, doesn't get all the fanfare, that John definitely deserves from but Andrew gave an Agile Infrastructure presentation. I was in that room, and I'm going to...
John Allspot told me that was his favorite presentation. So
there you go. And for me, just quickly, I had met Luke Knies, the other founder of Puppet, like a year earlier, and I was like, oh my God, Puppet is changing my life. Like, this is the way to do infrastructure. And then Luke says to me, you know, John, it's not only that, but operations people are going to start storing their stuff in like source control. I'm like, yeah, that ain't happening, buddy. You know, and a year later, I watch Andrew's presentation. I'm like, Luke was right. You know, so you know, there was 3 presentations at Velocity 2009. Unfortunately, his wasn't recorded, and the other one was recorded, which is Adam Jacob and Ezra. I could never pronounce his last name, but
Zagamunwitz.
Yeah, he was the founder of Engine Yard. They did. They introduced sort of how Chef could be used, and like I'd say a couple hundred people.
They built a botnet in the.
And they did it with the audience. It was like it just showed the power.
It was all security violations. But.
Yeah. But it was like Andrew said earlier, like you had cloud, you had this Puppet and Chef infrastructure code app, and you had this idea of like, could we change
there's this sequence, and it's sort of like the magic time, but you have, I met Patrick in Toronto, 2008, and we had some conversations there, and he'd already been writing about applying Agile to system administration. And there's like this focus on bringing some of these processes. I was really focused on and excited about the idea of being able to use APIs to do everything, right? And so then you have 2008, Velocity Conference 2008, Toronto Agile Conference, and then by 2009, I gave a talk at the Agile Conference that was called the Agile Infrastructure. That was kind of like operations for the Agile software people. And then I gave the talk at Velocity with the same name, but it was almost the opposite talk. It was about Agile practices for the operations people.
Yeah, and then, you know, you come out of that, and, you know, and then, so I'm in Ghent, I meet Patrick, and you know, I start talking to Patrick. So it is another where, like, I think my memory gets me in trouble, because I thought Patrick had asked me to run a conference in the US. Patrick says no, and I'm sure he's right, that I asked him would it be okay to do that. But I went back.
Success has many many versions.
I went back with Andrew, myself, and Damon Edwards, and I worked for Jesse Robbins, who was the CEO of Chef, and he was the chair of Velocity at O'Reilly. And I just asked Jesse, you know, do you think O'Reilly would get mad if we ran a 2-day conference after the 3-day Velocity? And like he checked, and they said, well, they were not going to do anything, like help you or anything, but they don't care if you do it. And so we ran the first DevOps days in the US, and as much as Ghent blew my mind, so, and this is where I get in trouble on my memory too, I think there were like 40 or 50 people in Ghent. There were 300 people 7 months later in Mountain View who were, like, the passion, like you could see from these young people that I met in Ghent, like, and I'm like, oh my God, this is huge. And then you see, by the time you get to Mountain View, there's 300 people, and some of the biggest names in our industry, you know, like I just go through the list, and we're all in there having these incredible conversations. And at that point, like, okay, this is not a hunch. This is a reality.
It's the time.
Yeah.
It's here. The other thing that I think is worth talking about a little bit is, for me, the magic of the format of the open space. And totally. I think sometimes people don't quite get that. They think they're here to hear people and like have speakers, which is fine. But to me, the magic is when you get peers in a room, they're all working on hard problems, some of which you've solved, some of which you're having questions about, and really being able to have that dialogue and build those relationships. And it doesn't necessarily end there. Like one of what I consider, my superpowers from DevOps, from these communities of practice is I'm pretty smart, but having this network of people who have seen all these other problems and solved all these other problems and being able to put that into the network and say, hey, I'm seeing this weird behavior with this thing, or I'm having this particular problem. And that could be about technology, that could be about weird process or politics, and having peers that have been through similar things say, oh, well, we did this, we saw that same thing, and that's where you start to have this network effect. That community of practice, the global community of people who are solving these problems, trying to improve these processes, trying to improve these tools, is what I feel is like the magic of this community.
The only sort of thing that I wish we could go back in time is I wish we could have recorded, because some of the greatest events I've been in were some of the, I can remember open spaces in Austin about burnout. And there were people crying. I was in an open spaces with John Allspart. It was called, "Is It Ever Okay to Fire Somebody?" And I think people don't sometimes realize about open spaces is, I think they're going to go and present, but I always tell people use that. Like you can propose I did something one time on a technology. It was in Israel, and I knew nothing about this technology, and I knew a lot of people in the room knew it. So I proposed to let's talk about this technology, and I knew nothing about it, and the whole thing was everybody sort of talking about, and I got to ask questions. So you can use open spaces as you can go in and present an idea that you have a lot of experience on, or you can present an idea that you have no experience and you happen to realize you're in a room with a bunch of people who have experience. Or you can just sort of try to solve a hard problem. Right?
One of the things I love about you, John, is when you kind of go into this cave and then come back with all this research, or you go follow some rabbit hole and drag back the Maslach research on the burnout stuff, introducing that into the conversation. And if you haven't seen this research on burnout, it's very, very good, because it's not about working too hard. It's really, really more interesting and complicated than that. You're doing the same thing with Deming right now, right?
Yeah.
So there's all these threads.
By the way, my youngest son bought me for my birthday Deming socks.
What are the Deming socks?
Deming socks. It's Deming's face all over my phone.
Oh.
So I wore them for y'all today.
That's a little creepy. But.
So yeah, I'm definitely, some people do think I'm creepy. Not in the DevOps community, but in other places. But no, if there's a great blog article. So somebody in the DevOps community, the LA DevOps community, this young man, he committed suicide. And it was somebody who I'd gotten to know. Not only time I knew him was at the conference. And it just melted me as a human. And I wrote a blog article about on Gene's IT revolution, and the response to that was couldn't imagine the emails and the comments. Anyway, and then we wound up meeting Christina Maslach, who was the foremost authority on organizational burnout, and we invited her into the DevOps community. She's spoken many times. Yeah, it's just sort of fun, the sort of boundary span, right? You just learn about other things. And that's, again, we're sort of doting over it, but
So I think the boundaries in some ways are artificial anyway. And then, you kind of see these cycles, and there's new buzzwords, right? So it's and it kind of drives me crazy, but it's also understandable that people are DevOps versus SRE.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right.
But then if you go back, and right in front of us, there's the slides for the next guy, and there's this reference to Toyota. So Nigel's going to talk in a bit, but it's a lot of what I consider the DevOps conversation goes back to Deming, goes back to Akoff, and there's these cycles. Also, the Senge stuff is very influential to me. Systems thinking stuff is very
yeah.
And it's we have these moments where things emerge and like people figure it out or like they make some progress, and then it's like they forget.
Yeah.
Right? So like Deming had all this stuff, and people made some progress, and you can see the impact of that. But then we almost had to rediscover it.
Here's another thing. Even when I don't think he's influenced me, he's influenced me. So the reason I got a book coming out hopefully this year on Deming. You know, so 10 years I've been obsessed with this person, and but I always thought the reason I was obsessed with Deming was I would say maybe the second best or the two best DevOps presentations ever given was by a gentleman named Ben Rockwood, who at LISA 2011 conference, he called it DevOps Transformation. And he basically started talking about Toyota, Toyocho Ono, Lean, and then Deming. And I like, and at the end of the presentation, this is another thing I think we have to do better at, even though I think we're great, is what Ben did is at the end of his presentation, it blew everybody's mind. He sort of passed it off as a torch and asked people to take the idea and move it forward. And I think we need to do more of that. Like, we can inspire people, but like, let's inspire people with a charter. Anyway, so I took that charter. In fact, I wrote a presentation at PuppetConf about sort of Deming and Lean and all this. And so I go through, and my whole life becomes consumed by how Deming influenced Japan and Toyota and how it came back in the U.S. And come to find at some point, it was actually Andrew's presentation influenced Ben to write about Deming.
It wasn't a presentation. It was an open space in Mountain View. Because I was starting, it was an open space, and we got on the topic, and I went through the 14 points. And
Deming's 14 points. So that was, and then, one of the things we were talking about this morning is we were trying to reflect on what are the things that we've done or that we sort of that have impacted the industry. And, I think we're bouncing around, but I think Andrew, I was at Chef, infrastructure as code, that was my sort of everything. And tangentially that was around cloud and all, but he went right into heavy cloud. He started working with some of the biggest cloud providers, doing some of the biggest cloud. And one of the things I love is how Andrew can phrase something and it just sort of, it has deep meaning and it's enjoyable. But tell us about the Meet Cloud Manifesto.
So the Meet Cloud Manifesto was a silly blog post that I made about give me an API or give me that.
Yeah,
that's basically the whole manifesto. And it came from doing some automation projects. And I think in particular, the thing that got me all worked up was trying to do this, it was an Oracle Universal Installer Java monstrosity thing that it was just I kind of want to back up because conceptually automate everything is a great idea, but in most cases when you're dealing with things that weren't designed to be automated, it's actually better to step back and think about why it exists and maybe revisit some of those architectures and those APIs so that you can move it forward, because just automating what's there is not always going to be as beneficial. In some ways you calcify some of that brokenness. But going back to this, there's this period of time, 2010-ish, where a bunch of us kind of wrote our version of what DevOps meant to us.
Yeah.
And I really wrote three things. One is that system administrators and software developers, and I was coming from being a software developer, should work together, which seems obvious, even at the time, but there's also all this kind of wall of confusion, political dynamic in a lot of cases. The second point that I made, which is related to this, is that software and system administration are really going to become the same thing, right? So at the time, when you think about when you have APIs to do provisioning, you could have APIs to do configuration, APIs to do monitoring, APIs to do all these things. Right against APIs, that looks suspiciously like software development. And we've already got this body of knowledge around process and body of knowledge and body of tools around how to do software development. So let's start applying those to the work that we're doing. And there's continuous integration and some of these other things. And then the last one I kind of already mentioned, which is this global community of practice. and being able to recognize that in the world we live in, and this is 2010, so we're a few years past this, but like we can talk to each other around the planet, right? Like I was having conversations on at the time we used Skype with all these people all over the world, talking to Patrick, talking to people, in Australia and Asia, and they're like facing the same problems, right? Yeah. So it's like why do we all need to go fight this same battle over and over and over alone? Let's connect all these things and say like we can get our. I was also always motivated by competitive advantage. Like I was trying to get competitive advantage. That's one of the points in that talk you mentioned. So it's like we're not competing to solve this like undifferentiated nonsense. Like let's create value through this community and build this fabric of solutions so that we can create more value. Because I believe in the human potential to create value, to create better things, and so that's my motivation is like, can we make it better? Can we make it better?
So like cut me off to talk about Deming, but like one of the things that as I was getting to the end of it, there's a narrative about how Deming influenced Japan and all that. And one of the sort of the stories that doesn't get told as much is what he explained to Japan is exactly what you said. We need to, like, it wasn't about like companies competing, like Mazda competing against Toyota. It was about Japan collectively competing against the rest of the world. And that's what happened. They didn't while Detroit was fighting between Ford and GM, and like he was teaching, sort of industries in Japan that like you are Japan. Anyway, the thing I wanted to jump to, like, because we definitely want to leave a lot of time for Q&A.
I actually want to hit one point because this reminds me of other issues I think we're still kind of dealing with respect to the dynamics of privilege and some of the ways decisions get made. But my understanding of this Deming story, because I've quoted Deming in almost every talk, so we'll just keep Deming threads. But the narrative I understand is he had demonstrated in the U.S. a lot of the ideas that he is going to ends up taking to Japan, right? So if you don't know this, like Japan has a Deming Award, and they have the
Deming Prize.
They have all this sort of history with those ideas, but those ideas were used in the U.S. But what my understanding is, we're
going down a dangerous path.
But I think it's a critical path. So there's all this factory optimization stuff that happens, and this could be like inaccurate, and you've done more research now, but this is my understanding, that Deming had done all this work in factories and kind of like all the ideas about social technical systems and like some of the stuff that we talk about in DevOps was applied to that, but it was during this time when there's this war, and most of that work is being done by women. And then when the men come back, they're like, oh no, no, command and control. Like that's okay for women to work.
The elevator pitch that's in my book, right? You can't buy it, so I'm not trying to sell it right now, so it's not done. But is that Deming is asked to teach a class at Stanford during the war for that very reason, because all the men and everything we had learned from sort of Sloan and GM, they're all gone. Right? And so all we have is retired and women and people who really have never worked in factories to build all this stuff. By the way, we're not building cars now, we're building tanks and planes and actually washing machines and stuff that have to go over the war effort. So they asked him to take his principles and put it in a class that I think the viral effect, they said, was like over like tens of thousands of managers and influential factory plant managers. He basically goes over to Japan after the war for MacArthur. So, and there's a book called A Reckoning where there's a thing in there where when the Japanese engineers and scientists would get an American plane that they had captured, they said they were sickened by the difference in quality between what they made and what was coming out of America. And they kind of knew where it was coming from. And so Deming goes over and he basically dusts off the class that the Americans throw out after the war, like, what's this nonsense? Why are we? That's not how you run a factory.
That's okay for women.
And he takes that course, literally dusts it off, and gives it to the JUICE, which is Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers.
And then they turn around and like
it's the same material.
Decimate the U.S. car industry.
All right, but I wanted to talk about DevSecOps.
Okay.
So we have a little bit of a disagreement on the history.
I think we've reconciled.
Yeah, we did reconcile it last night, right? So I remember there's a president. So like if you talk about DevSecOps, you have to, in my opinion, you have to start with a woman named Shannon Leeds, right? Like, and she coined the name, and she has been. I can't, like, other than Andrew, I don't think anybody else in this industry has influenced me more. I would say Damon Edwards, but maybe Patrick. But like, she, like, opened up my eyes to, like, in my opinion at this point, it's about 5 years ago, that we were missing an important narrative in the DevOps story. And I remember actually giving a presentation one time where I'm talking about, like, how great DevOps is, and I take my hat and I throw it on the floor, and I'm like, oh, darn it, we forgot about security. And Andrew did point out to me that there was, like, and I had seen him, like, he's like, John, you were at that DevOps day, and James Turnbull gave, I'm like, yeah. So there's, but I think what DevSecOps did to me is, and I like, again, I attribute to Shannon, and I met Shannon, and one of the things that happened right after that was this whole, like, this is another terrible thing we do, is arguing what the word cloud means. So an argument broke out in our...
If we just get the right definition, it's
going
to fix everything.
And so I would say, okay, here's the deal. Anybody who wants to argue about the word DevSecOps, at the end of my presentation, go to that side of the room. Because I'm going to be in that side of the room, sort of basically trying to figure out how to do, like, better stuff.
That's to me is like the words don't matter. It's like, what can you actually do? What are your capabilities? What are the promises you can make and keep with your practices?
Yeah.
So the thread that I would pull out here, and I think this is what we talked about in our reconciliation, is there's kind of this difference in worldview between the Puppet and Chef community, and even from the earliest day, James Turnbull, who also was a big influence on some of my thinking, was coming out of doing security at a bank, and a lot of this stuff with Puppet was being used in, sort of more regulated three-letter agency type stuff.
The chef people, we were cowboys. Sorry.
No, but Adam, philosophically, like his focus was building web infrastructure, right? And we already talked about velocity and web ops and that kind of stuff. And so there's maybe less necessity, less emphasis. And this is another interesting thing about DevOps is I think people sometimes look for like some magic paint by the numbers way to do this, but you have to understand the context you're working in, right? And when you think about the 10 deploys per day and Flickr conversation, the problem they're trying to solve is literally putting the cat pictures on the internet. And that's a different viable process from things that involve money, transactions, and then I think you can go down that spectrum even farther, and there's software where this is all life and death, right? So you get to the, there's crazy stuff going on now with the cars, but healthcare stuff, weapon systems, like whatever kind of thing, and the process that you're going to apply over here to put cat pictures on the internet should probably not be the same exact process and same exact approach as what you're going to do for the life and death.
And I never agreed with the whole, can we get as many cat pictures on the internet as possible? Because I'm a dog person. So like I was not, so, but.
We'll take dog pictures.
Yeah, that is. But no, I think that, that like, he's right about like the emphasis. Even though I came from an enterprise background, like I still tell people I have scars on my legs from doing a bunch of Tivoli consulting, if you even know what that word is. But there was this sort of, not only with security, but just in general, and there was this like waiting to happen argument that was brewing about DevOps really isn't for the enterprise. You can't, like, and the big four or big five or big three, I don't know what they are, how many numbers there are today, but they would make these arguments like, that's sweet and fun.
Go pay your cat pictures.
And but like we saw this emerging thing. Andrew had seen it earlier than me, but is Ross Clanton in the room? Come on, where's all these people I'm trying to attribute to? He's not. He was here yesterday. So him and Heather Mickman did a presentation in Minneapolis, DevOps Days, and it was Target, and basically it was, okay, now I got one. I can show the world that, that this can work, and you don't have to sacrifice, you don't have to compromise. And it was Heather Mickman who ran development at Target, and Ross Clinton, who actually is the inventor of the dojo. And they gave this presentation of how they work together. And then right after that, there was sort of an explosion, or right around the same time, of Gene Kim's DevOps Enterprise Summit. And like we started seeing all these companies. And the key point I want to make is there was an argument prior to that DevOps had to be compromised. You know what I mean? Like all that sweet and nice things that you kids are doing is great, but when it gets to the enterprise, you're not going to be able to do this. You can't do this. You know, back to even the way I originally felt like, no way were you going to make operations put, and like Git wasn't even, sort of invented yet, but like in Git, and not today, who runs operations?
So I want to pull us into this rabbit hole just a tiny bit more, but you have, there's this concept, the narcissism of small differences, and that organizations or groups that are very, very close to each other will often have more conflict, even though they're very similar relative to like a bunch of these other things around them. And so, part of me gets annoyed. I think I'm meddling with age and not as argumentative as I once was about like, DevSecOps versus DevOps versus SRE, when in some ways they're all the same. But at the same time, there is a value to expanding the conversation and adding those new ideas in a way. And what I feel is the benefit first of all, from like SRE's perspective, I really fell in love with SLOs, and like there's a bunch of other value there. Now I actually am trying to think through how to apply SLOs to security, like security level objectives. But then the value of DevSecOps for me, kind of like watching the evolution of these conversations in these communities, is it invited a new group into the party, right? So and this is the basis of our argument, I don't think security was missing from the DevOps conversations from the beginning so much as it didn't invite the existing security community into the conversation.
And that's why I agree. Like he was pointing at presentations where I was saying there was no security, and I was like, I was wrong. But he's right about the collective, because I'd worked with Mark Miller, who was at Sonatype, and Alan Schimmer, who was DevOps.com, and they started inviting me to a sub-conference at RSA, which first 2 years was called DevOps. And even though it was RSA, relatively no security people were showing up. Right? And in the third year, we called it DevSecOps. And all of a sudden, like all of the RSA security people, like half the people in the room were just security people. So I started asking people, like, why didn't you come last year? And the summary was, I didn't feel like I was invited. But when you put this sort of sec in the middle, I realized I better find out what the heck that is. So I think that did, it really, like probably the most important thing about that word was that it
invited more people to the party to be, this expanded community of practice that could solve these problems.
So we really wanted to leave some time for Q&A, but like the one thing, and I'll just leave it really quick, is one of my real heavy focuses over the last few years has been on this idea of automated governance and DevOps automated governance, and something that started out as a project with Gene Kim's org was supposed to be a paper that now is turned into a book, and it's going to be out in September, and there's like 7 authors on it, and it's called Investments Unlimited. It is the story of this thing that I've been sort of thinking about since about 2017, about audit and how IT risk is the sort of that last mile. Now, we got the dev and the ops working together. We got dev and AppSec seem to be doing okay, but we're still like terrible at communicating with IT risk. And so this book is sort of about a long narrative of how, in a fictional, and it's a Phoenix Project knockoff, like there's sort of a Phoenix Project Alex or Bill Eric thing, but I don't know if you had any comments, and I definitely want to get into a Q&A, so.
I always have comments, but I think there's even more people to invite, right? So there's risk, which hasn't been invited.
Right.
And in any of these, I mean, we spend a lot of time in highly regulated industries with our work right now at Red Hat, and and this goes back to the very beginning, but and this argument about it's not for the enterprise. Mm-hmm. What I see over and over and over again is all these investments in DevOps and developer productivity and operational efficiency are bottlenecking in these environments on security and compliance. So if you're not going to revisit the way that you do that, and I use the word impedance mismatch, which is another super engineering physics way to pose this, but if you're not going to bring security and compliance risk into that conversation, into that implementation from first principles, then you're not going to get any real value from these investments in the automation, because it's always going to go back to that bottleneck on that process.
Yeah, I mean, it's theory of constraints. I mean, I think most people should know, if you don't know, the Phoenix Project is a purposeful rewrite of a book called The Goal by Elliot Goldratt back in the 80s, where Elliot Goldratt described this sort of theory of constraints. And like what Andrew's saying, which is true, is, DevOps was a bottleneck. You sort of move that. The bottleneck always moves, right? And so, and what one of the bottlenecks right now is, we're doing a terrible job at I always say, the efficacy of audit and the toil related to audit. How many people do 30, 40-day audits? Nobody? All right, the rest of your life.
I mean, I feel like there's a lot of toil on the front side where you have to do the gymnastics to be compliant in the first place, and then there's toil on the back side to do the audits. As long as we're pulling on this, inviting people to the party thread, though, another thing that I see over and over is, people are making investments in dev and ops, and they build a better race car, but their product management is not necessarily feeding that or driving that race car effectively. So I feel like connecting the strategy in a meaningful way and meaningful feedback loops is missing a lot of organizations. And then I'm also fascinated, and I've kind of mentioned this in passing earlier, with the interplay between automation as an investment and architecture. Yeah. And being able to automate things is great, and I used to be the automate all the things guy, but then at some point you're like, this is not a good idea. We should probably change how this fails, how this scales, with the more direct first principles build, instead of making what this is be calcified in our automation.
Yeah, I think Andrew had some really, really cool ideas that he's emerging around the balance. We think DevOps, but what about product? What about architecture? I mean, how many people I walk into and they're like, John, can you just help me figure out how to fire all our architects? I'm like, no. That's not what we want to do here. We want to figure out how to get the architects who have built your business into the conversation.
Well, unfortunately, architecture got set up as this sort of straw man in the Agile conversations. And it's adorable to think that you can TDD things into good designs, but we can talk about it later. At a certain scale, if you don't understand architecture, then you can't really keep any promises about scalability and reliability and the rest of these things. So having that body of knowledge be more explicit about the numerical, quantitative and qualitative promises that you're trying to keep is what allows you to do. And this is another thing that I miss from some of the velocity conversations is all these people who've been building these planetary scale web systems, talking to each other about how they were keeping these promises about some of these quantitative and qualitative things. So
yeah, we could. Oh, look, Ross is here. You missed your shout out, dude. You were late for your party. So, do we have some time for Q&A? I mean, I think
we're down to
were we gonna? Yeah. So I mean, fire away.
Or we can keep talking until somebody gets the mic.
If you don't ask questions, you're going to have to hear us ramble.
I have a question. What's the most important thing I missed?
Your name.
Yeah, your shout out that you invented the dojo. We talked about your presentation in Minnesota. That sort of, I think, became the proof case that the enterprise doesn't have to compromise on DevOps. So there. Yeah, sorry.
So I'm so eager to get on the stage, I thought I'd join your conversation now. I was interested in what you're talking about Deming, and I'm going to throw in a few things on Deming, but I just wanted to correct a bit of history, a little bit of history.
Sure.
There's a guy by the name of Charlie Protzman. You should look him up. His grandfather, Charlie Protzman Sr., but also another guy by the name of Homer Sorensen. They were the first people into Japan after the war.
Oh, man, you got my book, because I'm telling you, Koyangi and how those guys basically, Sorensen was trying to leave out the half of profound knowledge. And it was Koyangi who created Jews. Like, trust me, I think 10 years
we talk
on this,
about that later.
Like, where they basically had to work around Sorensen because he thought using statistical process control was too advanced for emerging nations. So, yeah, we could go down this history, but
no, this is the thing. The reason it's so interesting is because Stewart was supposed to be Deming, but Stewart was sick.
Yeah,
and Deming got proposed by Sorensen and Protzman.
If Stewart would have gone to Japan, it would have been a whole different
story.
story.
Oh yeah, I agree with you.
Completely different.
I agree with you.
I mean, Stewart invented the whole. What Stewart gave to Deming was two parts of profound knowledge, which is epistemology and variation.
Don't disagree.
And then the other two were all Deming.
And actually, variations in the presentation this morning. We should talk.
Yeah,
I'm going to stop talking.
We can go
now.
on. I will find you.
So one thing that I want to point out that's related to this thread is there's this apocryphal, origin myth about this BOF in Toronto that I proposed. And then Patrick showed up, but I didn't, and I was actually just late. And the reason I was late is I was talking to Christophe Louvion, and I was learning about the work that Mary Poppendieck was doing, applying lean to software. And it was blowing my mind. And then I realized I was late, and I ran. And then I ended up hanging out with Patrick for hours after that. But I missed my puppet boss.
If you've ever seen Mary and Tom Poppendieck give a presentation, and she was the linchpin of lean to what we do. She wrote lean software.
In this, there is no root cause, chain of things, Mary Poppendieck had a huge influence on a lot of the things that I put into the DevOps conversation.
She was the connector between lean and software. But my favorite line from Mary Poppendieck was the question of how long does it get you to get one line of code change through your system?
The flow, what flows through the system.
Yeah, but how long does it take you? Whether it's a million lines? Or
sorry to cut you guys off.
You're not cutting us off.
Amazing.
We're here to have more conversations the rest of the day. So.
Yeah. Hey, thank you guys. What an amazing talk from John and Andrew. Give these guys a hand.
Thanks for having us.